Bonjour à tous, j'espère que vous allez bien et bienvenue pour cette nouvelle vidéo. Aujourd'hui, j'ai eu le grand honneur de m'entretenir avec Richard Parkinson, qui est professeur d'égyptologie à l'université d'Oxford et membre du Queen's College. Il a précédemment travaillé au British Museum et puis s'est spécialisé ensuite dans la poésie au Moyen Empire égyptien, et actuellement il est en train de travailler sur un commentaire sur le conte de Sinon. Alors cette vidéo est un petit peu particulière puisque vous vous en doutez bien, l'entretien s'est déroulé en anglais. Mais ne vous enfuyez pas, j'ai mis pour vous les sous-titres en français pour que vous puissiez suivre. Si vous aimez la vidéo, mettez un petit thumbs up et n'hésitez pas à cliquer sur abonnez-vous pour avoir les notifications dès qu'une vidéo sort. C'est parti. Hello, Professor. Thank you so much for agreeing on meeting me today to answer several questions that have been asked about ancient Egyptian literature. But before answering that question, could you tell me in a few words what path you've taken to get to the profession you're in today?
Right, well, I've been quite lucky in many ways. I studied Egyptology as an undergraduate at Oxford. I stayed on and I did a doctorate there. I then had a year teaching, but then I started work at the British Museum. And after a few short-term contracts, I became a permanent curator there for about 20 years. And then when the professorship at Oxford became vacant, I very much liked teaching. And so I moved back to Oxford at that point.
Great career.
It has been very lucky. There were jobs opening at the right time, so it's a matter of luck, I think.
So we're going to go through some questions that have been asked. Here we go.
Bonjour Laetitia, bonjour Monsieur Parkinson. Donc moi c'est Floriane et j'aurais une première question. Est-ce que vous pensez qu'il y a un rapport entre le contenu de certains textes en ancien égyptien, la matérialité du support avec l'utilisation de la pierre ou du papyrus et l'utilisation de certains hiéroglyphes?
Well, I am a great believer in what is termed material philology, which is the idea that texts are themselves artifacts. So I think it's very important text gets its meaning from when it is written, how it is written, and of course the material things with which it's written. And I think it's perhaps true of Egyptian texts even more so than many other texts. Because of the pictorial nature of the hieroglyphic script, it means it can be written in very many very splashy, spectacular visual ways. And so there's a whole set of laws about genre, what you can write where, how you write it. If you're writing a text commemorating a king, you choose hieroglyphs, you carve it in stone, you put it in a certain situation. If you are writing about the same king in a poetic text, you will use a different register of language, it will have a different aspect of fictionality, but it will also be written on entirely different surfaces. And so when Amenemhat is commemorated in a temple, that is done with certain sorts of writing, in certain sorts of context, using certain sorts of words. When he is written about in a poem, it is done very differently. He is portrayed in an entirely different manner. What really excites me, though, is when you're reading a papyrus, if you pay attention to the papyrus itself and not just the words, you can see how the copyist is thinking. You can see how he redips his pen. And I think that really brings home the importance of materiality. You get a sense of being there with the person. I think it gives you a touch of the real, which is very hard to get after thousands of years. So I would never read a text from an edition if I can. I would always try and read it from a photograph. And ideally, of course, I'd read it from the original in Egypt, in the Egyptian landscape. But especially at the moment, those things aren't possible.
Could you maybe specify what type of material we could write on?
The types of material you can write on in Egypt are virtually endless. People can carve on stone, they can paint and carve on wood, on walls, on furniture. For longer documents, you have papyrus, but you have wooden writing boards that are used for certain sorts of things. And then you have little flakes of stone or ceramic, which are used for notes and are disposable. And sometimes you can only tell what a text is about by looking at what it's written on. A passage of a poem, if it's on a papyrus, is perhaps a library copy from somebody's personal collection. If it's written on a bit of potsherd, it's probably a student exercise. And the fact it's on a potsherd is what tells you that it's a student exercise, that it's disposable. So, I mean, if you try and edit a text without paying attention to the material surface, I think you're being crazy.
Thank you.
Or certainly foolish, if not crazy.
Thank you. All right, next question.
Bonjour, donc moi c'est Baptiste. Donc ma question c'est est-ce que vous pensez que les textes de l'ancienne Égypte auraient le même impact de nos jours?
With Egyptian poetry, we have this huge difficulty that we don't know what it sounded like. And so it's very hard to get a sense of what the original impact of it was like. We don't have the sounds, we don't have any of the vowels, we've got a very vague idea of how the consonants would sound. So in a sense, it's impossible to gauge the full impact of an ancient work. If we had the vowels, if we knew what it sounded like, we would still have all the difficulties we have with other literatures, like Roman and ancient Greek literature. It comes from a different context. It comes from a different world. So when something happens in an Egyptian poem, it might mean something entirely different from what it would mean in Virgil, from what it might mean in Racine. All of these cultures are very different from ours. But I think what is remarkable about poetry is that it still can communicate much more than many other sorts of texts. And I think that's often, as Shakespeare scholars have remarked, because it's fictional, it is slightly autonomous. It is not just about giving a message, it is about giving a message in a aesthetic, in a moving, in a self-contained manner. And so often with ancient literature, I think we can get a sense of what the past felt like. But the difficulties and the distance is absolutely immense. And so I think the first time you read an ancient Egyptian poem in a university class, say, all you're doing is worrying about what does that word mean? What is that verb form? And when you've gone through that and you read it again, it still means absolutely nothing. And I think what you do in, say, writing a commentary is if you try and gather all the other similar phrases and verses, you can gradually build up a picture of what that verse might have meant to the original readers. Is it funny? Is it ironic? Is it passionate? And I think another way of trying to deal with this is to invite performers. And I work a lot with actors. And I think if you can coach an actor and get them to bring their skills to an ancient Egyptian text, you can sidestep a lot of these difficulties. When you hear an actor performing Racine, at least for an English person, it actually means something. You hear the emotion. If you're reading it on a text page, it can seem much more remote. So I think that's what it's how I try and give a bit more life back to these texts.
I've actually seen, I'm interrupting you, sorry.
No.
Okay. I watched the video, shame on me because I don't remember her name, where a woman was basically reciting, I think it was Zayavsinu, right? And so my question is how, and that was actually really, really good. It was really nice. But my question is, how can one, as you said, be able to tell the story if we don't really know what the writer meant and how he was thinking the story? That makes sense. I don't know if I'm clear.
Absolutely.
Okay.
It's just the same problem we have when we read any modern novel. How do we imagine for one moment what Flaubert meant with Madame Bovary? We don't know. And what the poem does, what the novel does, is it invites us to read and to empathize, to sympathize, to guess. And so it sets up dialogue. And the dialogue between us and Flaubert is quite easy, but it's quite difficult still. And no reading of a novel, of a poem, is ever correct or right. We can't know. I can't know what you're thinking or saying exactly at this moment. It's just a guess of communication. With ancient Egyptian works, the only difference is it's a long time ago and it's from a very different culture. But we've still got to make that same sort of educated guess, to take the risk. I think the one thing that is absolutely wrong is to assume that these texts did not have meaning or did not have emotion. If we go very scientific and objective and just say, ooh, lexicography, philology, verb forms, we are doing something that is very different from what the ancient Egyptians meant. I don't think they wrote their poems to be grammatical exercises in Gardner's grammar. If that's all they are, then we have got it wrong. I think anything else, it's a guess. And I can say my guess is better than other people's because I've got lots of parallels and lots of references. And I believe I've got a sense of it. But there's no such thing as academic certainty. If there was, it all would have been done and over with, and we'd all be out of our jobs by now. So,
of course.
No.
Et moi, j'aurais une deuxième question. Il me semble avoir vu un exemplaire d'un livre de Elizabeth Peters sur l'égyptologue fictive Amelia Peabody. Et qu'est-ce que vous pensez de l'impact de ce type de roman sur la pratique de l'archéologie? Voilà, merci.
I find novels that deal with ancient Egypt very intriguing, because I think novelists in many ways are trying to do exactly the same thing as academic historians are trying to do. They're trying to recreate a sense of the past of another world. And the actress I work with is also a historical novelist, and I find her approach to ancient history extremely intellectually provocative and very informative. And I think when one reads a novel, the novel is often focused on emotional things such as sympathy and empathy. And I think those are qualities that are very useful for the sort of work I do on Egyptian literature. They are also the sorts of things that academics very often underplay and forget about. So in many ways, I think novelists can be absolute models for what a historian should do. And if one thinks of the great Philippe Deschamps, he was profoundly influenced by the writings of Margaret Yourcenar, of course. Having said all that, I don't really care for trivial literature. And I've worked a bit on early English novels from the 1920s, which are basically pulp fiction, novels by people like Rider Haggard, Sax Rohmer, The Green Eyes of Bast, The Curse of the Pharaohs, this sort of thing. And I think what they do to ancient Egypt is deeply unethical. And they're fun. They're good adventure stories. They are very good for children to read. They're exciting, they're silly, they're trivial. But I think they come out of a very disrespectful attitude that's colonialist. And I find it very distasteful when we still, as Egyptologists, have all this sort of cultural baggage behind us. And I worry about the Indiana Jones films are wonderful. Harrison Ford is a wonderful actor. But what does that say about Egyptology? If you take Indiana Jones as your theoretical, methodological mentor, you are not going to really understand ancient Egypt. And this seeking something that is easy and trivial, sensationalist, orientalist, is something I think the subject has long abandoned. If we want to try and recreate a sense of what life was like for these real living people, I think novels that provide stereotypes not only of ancient peoples but of modern people, detectives, adventurers, explorers, etc., it's to have a cartoon vision of the world full of really cheap, nasty stereotypes. So I'm really uneasy with some novels. They're good for what they are, but I think some people perhaps are over-influenced by them. But I like my Margaret Yourcenar. I do not like trivial literature, I have to say.
Alors bonjour à tous, je m'appelle Jennifer. Déjà merci de bien vouloir répondre à nos questions. Et ensuite j'aurais voulu savoir quel type de littérature on pouvait trouver en Égypte antique.
Well, I think ancient Egyptian texts are very much produced by the court and by the government. And so they have a very sort of elite worldview. And if we're thinking about fictional literature, that is also coming from the same sort of place. And so in the Middle Kingdom, the classic period that I tend to work on, the poems are mostly about state affairs of politics, religious sometimes, but a social aspect of a person trying to position themselves within their own culture. And they are mostly about men. There's very little to do with women in Middle Kingdom literature, and there is very little romance. So if one compares an ancient Egyptian poem with a modern novel, one expects there to be at some point man meets woman or whatever, and romance, and that really only happens in late Egyptian literature, which is much more episodic and less structured. So we are getting with literature very much a particular worldview of a particular group of people at a particular time. And that means, of course, it can tell us a lot about that society in the same way, of course, that modern novels can tell future generations a huge amount about our society. But despite all these limitations, the range of Egyptian literature, I think, is pretty immense. It's different. There is no genre of comedy or tragedy. There's nothing really resembling European or classical drama that we can tell. But still, it can convey, I think, intense feeling and intense intellect. With the poem of Sinuhe, you have moments where you hear the narrator understanding his life for the first time as he speaks to the audience. He is meditating about very Egyptian things. It's very specific, but he is still speaking in a voice that we can recognize as something that is deeply and profoundly human. And despite all the differences, despite the different emphases, what it means to be a person in the 12th dynasty, nevertheless, one can still hear a very recognizable voice. So I think ancient Egyptian literature can tell us a lot about ourselves in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different contexts, which is exactly what any sort of world literature can do. Yeah, I think it's great. It has lasted. It has lasted longer than almost any other literature in the world, so it still can be read.
Could you tell us a little bit about Sinuhe?
Right. Sinuhe is a poem written about 1850 BC. It is pretending to be an official autobiography of a courtier. The trouble is his life doesn't go smoothly, it goes wrong. And the poem is actually a sequence of nervous breakdowns. As his life falls to pieces, he tries to rebuild it abroad. He realizes that his life has been a sham and he needs to return home to Egypt. And eventually, through good fortune and the king's grace, he does. And it should be a triumphal narration of exciting adventures. And it is, but it has this psychological depth of worry and anxiety, of testing reality against fiction, of trying to understand the world around oneself in a way that I think can speak. It's the most famous of Egyptian texts. Sir Alan Gardner said it was the text that gave us the closest sense of what it was like to be alive in the ancient world. And I think that's true. It's short. If you listen to it in a recording, it's 40 minutes long. But my God, it takes you through a vast range of experiences, different landscapes. You know, it is living a life and exploring themes and concerns that we still all have. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be where I am now? It's good. It's pretty damn good.
All right, people, the links are below the video. Please go take a look. And thank you very much, Professor, for answering the questions. It's been a pleasure to have you and an honor. Yes, thank you very much and have a nice weekend. I don't know which day we are because of this crisis and coronavirus, but have a nice.
Whatever day it is, and thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you. Okay.
Merci à tous d'avoir suivi cette vidéo. Je vous retrouve samedi à 11 h. Désormais, notre rendez-vous hebdomadaire. Salut, prenez bien soin de vous.